future digital home. So this is another example of doing a study which tells us something about system design which we would not have known unless we did the study first, right? Or unless we did the study. And in particular, it's things about system design that are important to keep in mind when we start building the system, as opposed to just to make the system slightly better afterwards. So I'm sure most of us already have a bunch of gadgets at home, right? We have our digital cameras. We have maybe a network drive. We have a TV that can stream Netflix, things like that. So in the near future, this will become much more extreme. We'll have dozens of devices in our home, which will either gather information or will store information that we put on them, or will be used for viewing information. And you can think about this information being media, whether it's music or video or home surveillance. You can think of it as being just files like tax records or homeworks or papers. You can think of it as being things such as your shopping list or the current contents of your fridge. Right? Your fridge is going to have a little computer built in. It's going to keep track of how much milk is left, and you're going to want to use your phone once in a while to ask your fridge how much milk there is, because you're going to be walking by a grocery store and wondering whether you should pick up milk. So there are exciting new features and capabilities here from a user perspective, right? But on the other hand, there are also big questions. And one of the big questions is who handles security and reliability, right? In this environment with many, many devices in my home that all somehow talk to each other and share data, I want to make it the case that I can always access all the information, confidential or otherwise, that belongs to me, and I can also let any of my friends or specific friends gain access to this information. But at the same time, I might have really confidential data in the system, and it could be really terrible if the wrong person got access. And at the same time, here we're dealing with people who are not professional system administrators, right? The only people in the home are the people who live there. They don't take a class in system administration, and so the interfaces that they use to configure the system correctly, or to tell the system what they want the system to do, have to be somehow specifically tailored to them. They don't have to. They can't require much expertise. So our goal in this particular project is to build a system that really supports end users and enables them to effectively specify their access control and reliability policies, and understand the policies that have been set on the system and the effects of those policies. Now, perhaps having learned something from previous projects that we've done, we decided here to start out by doing a bunch of user studies. And the reason is that technical researchers are notorious for being poor judges of what end users do, right? If we as technical researchers build something that we think is a cool system, often it's a system that's usable only by us and not by end users. So here, since our target was end users who have little expertise in computer administration, we wanted to do a bunch of studies to figure out really what they think about access control, what they think their needs are, what they currently do about access control, both for the digitally stored data they have now, and for things that they might have in paper form, but that we can imagine being in digital form soon. Right? So we interviewed a bunch of these people and tried to ask them about how they structured their access control policies. That is, what were the various conditions that they took what were the various conditions that they considered when deciding whether or not somebody should have access to a particular file, and what were various features of the system that they might consider using or that they would really want to use in order to specify access control policies. So the first study we did was an in situ semi-structured interview study. So what this means is that we recruited a bunch of users, in this case from non-programmer households, and we actually sent a team into their homes to interview them about the subjects that I talked about in the previous slide. We interviewed a total of 33 users from 15 households. They were a variety of households, right? We had families, we had couples, we had roommates. We also had people of various ages from 8 to 59. And we also covered a pretty wide range of expertise, in the sense that even though there were no programmer households here, we had households that had as many as 20-something devices for 2 people, or as few as 4 or 5 digital devices for a family, or 3 or 4. As part of the interviews, we had the participants draw maps of their households, and on these maps indicate where various digital devices might live. And we used these maps later to make sure that when we talked about the various digital devices and various types of data, we could actually cover all the devices that they had. Here's an example of a kind of specific scenario that we might start an interview with. We could say, imagine that a friend of yours is in your house when you're not. What kind of files would you want that friend to be able to access? And access might mean view or change. Then we might follow that up by saying, would it be any different if you were also in this house? Or would it be any different if you were also in this room? Right? So we'd start out with some sort of scenario like this, and then we would sort of go on in a more ad hoc manner depending on how people answered. Since we were interested in how strongly people felt about each possible scenario, right? If you just ask people about what features they want or whether they want features A, B, and C, of course everybody is likely to say, yes, I want this feature. This is a cool feature to have. I don't know how often I'll use it, but sure, why would I say no to a new feature? And so one way to figure out which features people really want is to rate their concerns on a so-called Likert scale. So this is when we talk about a specific scenario. Get people to tell you how much they care about the scenario on some sort of numerical scale. In this case, we used the scale from 1 to 5, where 1 meant I don't care at all, 2 might have meant I care a little bit, and 5 meant I really care. It would be terrible if this bad thing were to happen. And so and now when we wanted to compile of the list that people really cared about, we only looked at those where they answered 4 or 5. That is where they indicated that they really cared about the answer. So what did we find? I'll go through a series of findings, some of which are more exciting than others. The first finding is that people do in fact worry about sensitive data. Right? Almost everybody that we interviewed had concerns about how to protect their data from unauthorized access. In many cases, they had specific scenarios that they had in mind where they thought it would be terrible if somebody were able to access this particular piece of data in this particular case. And many of them had actually suffered security breaches. That is, somebody gained access to some file that they didn't want the person to see. So people care about access control. The next thing we found is that the access control mechanisms people used were varied and often ad hoc. Now, there's a bunch of people, there's a small set of people who used access control mechanisms that were built into the various operating system and tools, such as encryption in user accounts. But there were very few of those, right? Definitely a small minority used the access control mechanisms that were built into their computer systems. What many more of them did is use various ad hoc mechanisms. So here's a couple of popular, here's one popular ad hoc mechanism. It's if you want to protect a file, you hide it somewhere in a file system. You nest it in a bunch of directories with weird names. And you give the file itself a name that doesn't indicate anything about the content that's in the file. Right? This turns out to be a somewhat common method of protecting access to your digital data. Another method that we encountered that indicates that the access control methods the systems have today really don't work for end users is that some people were so worried about not being able to adequately protect their data that they just chose to delete it. Right? They couldn't convince themselves that their system would protect their data well enough, so they decided the only thing they could do is just remove the data from the system. We found that people had quite complex policy needs. If you think about the sharing mechanisms built into Windows or Mac OS or iTunes, usually what they try to do is they want you to divide your files into a set called private and a set called public. And then for the set called public, you pick which are the users who can see these. Right? So some sort of fairly coarse-grained, not quite binary, but definitely coarse-grained sharing method. Now, it turned out that the users that we interviewed really needed something much, much more detailed, much more fine-grained. So not only was there, did they think about groups more fine-grained than just public and private, right? They had different policies for friends, for family, for colleagues, for strangers, and so on. But they had many, many exceptions to these policies, right? So even if you had a whole bunch of groups for assigning policies to people, that still wasn't enough for the guys that we interviewed.